So I've made some progress since our last presentation, and I'll just give you a really quick update about some of the changes that I've made to my game. Now, I have a simple starting point, a starting landing pad, and a goal landing pad, and I've sculpted my environment to make it look more like a lunar or Martian surface. So here's the goal landing pad, and it's just a couple of cubes that have been have a material applied to them, and the goal is that I want to be able to leave the landing pad and land on the goal, and then reveal the message to the user. So something just really simple. I have applied a real simple particle effect to my rocket, and I have that dialed in just the way that I want it. And rather than recreate that on screen, I'll just go over the basic concepts of turning on and off a particle effect if you want to go for a similar effect. I'll also cover some basic sound. And then we'll talk about all the content that you need to know to wrap up this project. So again, the goal is that we want a simple game that once the user completes the level, they're rewarded with a basic message. In my case, I'm going to do just a simple message, we're moving or we've moved, and that'll be the conclusion of this presentation. We'll talk about a basic menu system. And so I'm not going to cover everything click by click through Playmaker, but I will cover kind of the broad concepts here on how to pull some of this stuff off. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this particle effect that I've added to my rocket. I'm just going to go into my rocket, and I do want to point out that I have several state machines on this rocket. I'm breaking down the individual mechanics and attaching them to the rocket. So I have this lateral movement, which just causes the rocket just to drift ever so slightly. When I rotate the rocket to the right, you'll notice that as I rotate to the right, I'll just kind of get up in the air here. If I go to the right or the left, you can see that the rocket moves to the right or to the left just a little bit. So it applies just a little bit of a lateral force to it. And that just kind of smooths out the user interaction. I've also included a rocket landing, and this is just a really simple collision test event that tests to see if it's landed on a surface. And then later I could test if it's been the landing pad or the goal or the planet surface or whatever else. And again, that's just something that I can use down the road to detect what I've run into or landed on. I have this basic mechanic that controls the rocket rotation, and again, we covered that in the previous presentation, and now I'm back to my thrust mechanic. Now my thrust mechanic just operates off of a mouse press, but you can dial in that mechanic based on your user input any way that you want. But basically, on the thrusting side, we're simply adding a force to the rocket. Now the thing that I've added that you can see here is I have an activate game object. And the activate game object is what I'm using to turn on the particle effect. And just to run through this really quickly, if I go into my assets, standard assets, I could open up some particles. And from the particles that come with this package, like if I wanted to start off with maybe a simple flame or fire, maybe I want to use this as my rocket thrust. I could take this flame and go in and find the different elements in here and dial those in. Now I'm going to get rid of the flame, and I want to point out that I've downloaded instead of standard assets here. If I go into my simple particles, I've downloaded simple particles, and that's a package that Unity puts out, and you can get that through the asset store, and that's what I used to get my rocket thrust started. And it was just kind of a simple variation on some basic particle effects. So there's a kind of a torch effect in here that I liked quite a bit, and I'll just bring that into the scene, and I'll move that up. Let's try another one. That one's so there we go. So this first torch effect that I have here, I'm not going to tweak the effect to get it exactly the way that I want it, but I will rotate that in the general direction. Now I would line this up and change the size of it, but I'll just leave this off to the side for now, and I'll make that a child of the rocket. Now back to the rocket mechanic, if I were to, on the thrusting state, want to turn this element on, I can do that with an activate game object. So I'll just jump into my actions, and I'll look for activate game object. I'll double click. And the game object that I want to activate is not the owner. I'll specify a game object, and now I can drag in my new torch element. Okay, the active switch needs to be turned on. And so if I were to start with my default state, if I go into my inspector and just uncheck, when we're talking about activate game object, we're talking about the checkbox that's just to the left of the title of the object in the inspector. And this really works with any object, could be turned on or turned off. So as an example, if I go to my landing pad here, the striped version, if I toggle that little check mark next to the title, that turns the object is not active, it is now active. So this is an easy way to kind of show and hide geometry and effects, in this case this particle effect. So I'm going to go back to my rocket, and remember I'm doing this on my thrust mechanic. So I've just activated the object. So now when I hit play, because I've turned the object, well, hang on a second, I've turned that object off towards green. I'll make sure it's in the off state. Now when I hit the play button, when I click on my left mouse, it'll turn that thrust on. Now I got a little bit of a problem because I've just released the mouse and it has not turned back off. So I need to go back into my thrust mechanic, go back to my idle state, and add another instance of my activate game object. And I'll do the same thing I did in the first, or in my second state here, but I'll just do the opposite. I'll make sure that the active state is turned off. So in the idle state, the activate game object is turned off, and in the thrusting state, it's turned on. And so now we have this effect that whenever my mouse button is pressed down to the ground, I have the particle effect that's turned on. When I release the mouse, it turns off. So that's the basic concept for that thrust mechanic, but at least the visual effect, the way that I implemented it. So I'm just going to get rid of that second particle effect and clean up my action states here. The other thing that I'll want to do is integrate a sound. I want some kind of sound effect. Now there's a couple of different ways to do sound. The first and simplest way that we lack a lot of control is we can simply attach a play sound command. Now I've already made a sound folder in here somewhere, sounds, and so I can create a folder in here and just drag in the sound that I want to play. I can drop that and replace the existing sound, and I can sample this and hear that I have this rocket thrust. Now I could go to the thrusting state, and if I search for a sound command, I could play sound. And if I double click, you'll see that I get this play sound action. I could just drag whatever clip that I want in here. So if I just drag this over and load that clip in, that's one way to activate sounds. Now you'll see that I lack some control. Even though it's playing the sound when I release the mouse and it goes back to the idle state, I want to achieve the same effect that I did with the particle effect, which is I want to be able to turn that sound off. And we actually lack the ability to turn that sound off. This is what's called a one-shot sound. When we play sound, it's kind of a really simple way to play an existing sound, which is good for kind of a one-hit sound effect. It's a really simple way to control this, but I want to have more sophisticated control over this. So I'm just going to remove this action. And instead of playing sound, what I want to do is I want to see what other options I have in this audio category. So I'm going to delete my search field and go into audio. And I have the ability to play audio clips, okay? And now in order to do this, we need to actually set an audio clip on the object. So this is a slightly more complicated method. I'm just gonna, it's not too complex, but it takes a little bit more care than our previous setup. So I have a couple of different ways that I can control this. Normally when we play sound in Unity, what we need to do is go to Component, Audio, and I need to add an audio source to the object. Okay, and when I add an audio source, you can see that I get another component on the object here that says audio source, and this gives me the ability for this object to play a sound. Now I've already added an audio source component to my rocket, and I'll be able to utilize that. So again, if I want this object to play an audio source action or an audio source file, I need to have that audio source component added. Now once I do that, I can start to attach some of these other actions. So what I want to do is I want to do an audio play action on the thrust. So I'll just double click. So right now it's going to play whatever audio source happens to be loaded into this audio clip field. More about that in just a second. So I'm playing whatever sound happens to be attached on the thrusting state. And now you'll see when I hit the play button, it's not going to really play anything because we have not yet defined the sound. Okay, I can define the sound a couple of different ways. I could drag in an audio clip in here. I could drag in an audio clip over here and load it in as the audio clip, and now we should start to hear the sound. Okay, so when I hit the play button, because that audio component has been defined with a specific clip, I can now play that rocket sound. Now, currently the audio play is playing whatever audio sound happens to be attached here, so I'm just setting the audio clip, okay? I can click on this little bullet and tell this to go to none, and so it's no longer associating the sound that I dragged in with that audio clip. If I go back to the thrust idle state, so I'm idling in the thrust, what I could do is do an audio stop. So now I have, whenever we're in the idle state, we've stopped. Whenever we're thrusting, we played. Now I've just disconnected the rocket thrust sound with my audio source component. So again, I can drag this back in and declare and say, hey, oops, hey, this is the sound I want to play. When I'm talking about an audio source, this is the sound clip that I want to play. So now when I hit the play button, when I press the mouse button, it plays the sound. When I release the mouse button, the sound cuts off. So I now have an audio and a visual effect to my rocket thrust, which is going to give the user a more kind of satisfying experience using the game here. So now I had to jump through all those hoops, and I have a lot more control over the sound. One other thing that I could do is that I could also set the audio clip through actions. So rather than manually dragging this clip in and setting the audio clip this way, I could just click on this little bullet and tell it to set it to none. So right now my audio clip is not set. I have an audio source component, but the audio clip is not set. And what I could do is I could add a state, and in this state we could do a set audio clip. Okay, so I have state 1. I'll do a finished transition and wire that over to my first active state. Now I'll right click and set this as the start state. So now I have a 3-state machine on my rocket thrust. And again, it loops back and forth between idle and thrust just like we did before, but now the difference is that it passes through an initialization state. In fact, I'll call this state, I'll call this init. And I like to do this a lot with initialization states. So we pass through the state one time to set any variables or any audio clips or any kind of initialization that we want to achieve inside this scene. And in this place, we can set the audio clip. Now, the advantage of doing it this way and setting the audio clip on the fly is that depending on what kind of results we could attach sounds on the fly. So maybe I have multiple rockets, different kinds of rockets that the user can select, and based on what rocket the user selects, maybe they have a different sound effect for the thrust. Okay, and in that case, we can dynamically kind of attach different sounds and control it in much more effective ways. So that's just a really high-level overview about adding the visual thrust effect and the audio effect to the thrust. Other things that I want to talk about in the next presentation is I want to talk about adding a real simple time component to this. And then I want to talk about completing the goal. And at that point, we'll address the menu, the user menu on the front end of this game. And I think you have all the nuts and bolts you need to successfully complete this project. This project should come together pretty quick. It should be a simple, well-executed project that relies on everything that we know now about Unity and Playmaker, that comes together to present a really simple game that ends in a simple greeting message. So we'll push forward in the next presentation and talk about a timer and the user interface, and then we'll focus on this end goal of the reward to the user. But we'll do that in the next presentation.